A statement made the Ice City wealthy family rediscover the adopted daughter brought back by the Geng family, for the reason that she wanted to climb onto a branch and become a phoenix, and was kicked out by the Geng family. Miss Geng, the eldest daughter of the Geng family, is talented and charming. She is one of the outstanding young ladies in the Ice City. The adopted daughter who was brought back is uneducated and accomplished nothing, and cannot be compared to Mississippi when Xin, the adopted daughter of the Geng family who left, began her own life of cheating. She was a divine doctor who treated Lady Mu in the capital, a special prize winner in the piano competition, a composer of the Heavenly King level, and the ruler of the largest physics and biology comprehensive laboratory, one vest after another, one hot search after another, online teaching those who have eyes but no eyes how to be a good person. Look. That woman is pestering my Heavenly King brother. Sorry, I already have a partner. Until one day, the Prince of Vinegar couldn't help but abandon his noble and aloof demeanor. He held the woman's slender waist with one hand, his eyes slightly closed, and he spoke softly, "Little girl, when will I reveal my identity?" Keywords of the novel. The little ancestor of the big boss's family is wild and fierce with no pop-ups. The little ancestor of the big boss's family is wild and fierce. Download the complete text, and read the latest chapter on the little ancestor of the big boss's family is wild and fierce. Chapter 1. Is just an adopted daughter. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 1 is just an adopted daughter. The weather in Ice City in April is still cold, with snowflakes falling in large numbers in the sky. When Xin came out of the hospital and gently pulled her scarf, burying her fair and translucent chin in it. The phone in her pocket vibrated gently, and when Xin furrowed her brows. She took out the phone from her pocket and lightly tapped it to open it. The screen displayed a photo of a man and a woman entwined. Pressing the screen of the phone, a bright light flashed in the cold and evil eyes. He put the phone back in his pocket and walked towards the bus stop on the roadside. Getting off the bus, when Xin walked on the thick snow, and a creaking sound sounded under his feet, making the once deserted street even more silent. When Xin walked into the villa of Geng's estate and stood at the entrance. Before she could even enter, she heard the sarcastic voice of Geng Qiu in the living room. Dad, when Xin is not your biological daughter. She was brought back by your mother only as a last resort. You have already bestowed a favor on her by keeping her in the Geng family. Why should you give her the opportunity to marry the Zhao family? I don't care, I grew up with brother Yuzheng from a young age. Dad, did you listen to me? Hurry up and kick her out. Anyway, I'm already in good health now and I don't need her at all. You don't have to worry about Mom, anyway Mom doesn't like her either, Mom will definitely agree. Geng Qiu knew in her heart that if it weren't for Wen Xin changing her liver, her mother wouldn't have brought Wen Xin back. She hates Wen Xin. Wen Xin is so dazzling that every appearance attracts everyone's attention. Even if she is useless, her appearance and temperament can still instantly kill her. Geng Shikue, who had been sitting silently on the sofa, let out a soft sigh. Geng Qiu's words hit his heart and he also disagreed with the marriage between Wen Xin and the Zhao family. However, for some reason, the old lady of the Zhao family chose Wen Xin. If Wen Xin were to leave now, it would indeed save a lot of trouble. Okay, then let her leave as soon as she comes back. Anyway, her attitude towards our family is neither cold nor warm, and she will eventually be immature. Standing outside the door, Wen Xin listened to the conversation between the father and daughter of the Geng family. Her delicate thin lips slightly rose, and a hint of sarcasm flashed in her indifferent eyes, indicating that the things she had prepared were not needed. Wen Xin was able to come to the Geng family in the first place because the Geng family humbly begged for it. When they asked her to have her liver cut before, they didn't have this attitude. Sure enough, when she got better, she became a useless person and wanted to kick her away. Coincidentally, this is also what she needs. Gently pushing open the door, when Xin walked into the villa as if nothing had happened, glanced at the father and daughter sitting on the sofa, and without looking back, prepared to go upstairs. Stop. Where did your upbringing go, Wen Xian? Grandma always praises you for being obedient and sensible. Are you just so obedient and sensible? Didn't you see your dad here, and you didn't even say hello? Geng Qiu stood up excitedly from the sofa. As soon as she thought that she could kick Wen Xian out of the house today and be with Yu Zheng's brother, she couldn't resist her inner excitement. Wen Xian stopped and lifted her hand to push down the down jacket and hat on her head. A fair and cold little face was revealed, and her cold eyes became increasingly dark and profound. Uncle. Wen Xian stopped and looked sideways at the man sitting on the sofa, with a cold and intimidating black eyes. If Geng Qiu didn't mention her grandmother, Wen Xian could still be at peace with these people, but Geng Qiu happened to mention her grandmother at this time, and his restlessness and depression couldn't be suppressed. End of this chapter. Chapter 2. Unforgettable Leaving. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 2. Unforgettable Leaving. Qiu, Shikue, we're back. The snow outside is so heavy that my mother.in.law and I went to Zhao's house to sit for a while before coming back. At this moment, Su Li came in from outside with the old lady of the Geng family, took the towel handed over by the butler, and swept the snowflakes off the old lady's body, speaking with an excited tone. Su Li poured a cup of hot tea for the old lady, and when she looked up, she saw Wen Xian standing in the living room wearing a pure white down jacket, without changing her shoes, standing directly on the expensive carpet. The originally excited emotions were replaced by anger. Angry, he walked over to Wen Xian and forcefully pushed her, saying, "How many times have I said, change your shoes when you go home? When will the broken habit you developed from the countryside be corrected? You can't be like your sister, a bit of a lady from a wealthy family. Mom, don't be angry with your sister. You and your grandmother are going to the Zhao family. What does the Zhao family say?" Geng Qiu walked up to Su Li, took Su Li's arm, leaned his head on Su Li's shoulder, and acted coquettishly towards her. The long eyelashes flickered like a fan, and the delicate little face was filled with the shyness of a little girl, like a delicate flower. She knew the purpose of Su Li and Mrs. Geng's visit to the Zhao family, while Geng Qiu was more concerned about the outcome. At this point, she was no longer in the mood to pay attention to Wen Xian's affairs. Wen Xian was forcefully pushed by Su Li to the staircase, with no unnecessary expression on her face. She knew in her heart how struggling and conflicted Su Li was able to let her live in this home. Su Li can tolerate her existence entirely because her precious daughter's life requires her liver, that's all. Watching the intimate appearance of the mother and daughter, Wen Xian rolled her eyes calmly. She was curious to know if Su Li would also be so kind to Geng Qiu if it weren't for her identity as the eldest lady of the Geng family. Wen Xian had a light and slow attitude, lazily leaning against the escalator, with one leg slightly bent. He looked both yuppie and difficult to deal with. Looking coldly at the person in the living room, this matter had some connection with her. She disliked trouble, so she also wanted to hear how the matter was resolved. Speaking of the Zhao family's situation, Su Li sighed somewhat embarrassed and sat down on the sofa, pulling Geng Qiu. "Qiu, you also know that the Zhao family is led by Mrs. Zhao. Although Mrs. Zhao disagrees, Mr. Zhao insists on letting your sister." As Su Li spoke, she couldn't help but glance at Wen Xian standing lazily at the staircase, her eyes filled with resentment. "Mom. I am the eldest daughter of the Geng family. What is she? Why does she use her identity as the eldest daughter of the Geng family to marry the Zhao family? Mom. Alright, you are the miss of the Geng family. What does it look like to be looked at by outsiders like you?" As she watched Geng Qiu act recklessly, Mrs. Geng spoke up to stop her. "When I came back, I thought a lot." Mrs. Zhao clearly misunderstood Wen Xian's identity. "Tomorrow, your father will make an announcement that Wen Xian has nothing to do with the Geng family. You are the only miss of the Geng family. Not everyone is worthy of being the miss of the Geng family. After Mrs. Geng finished speaking, she took a meaningful glance and stood in the distance without any formal warmth. When Xian, the Geng family treats you well. Although you were brought back by your mother, your uncle has never mistreated you. Getting a satisfactory result, when Xian was rarely in a good mood, with a cold smile on her face. I will leave the Geng family today. After speaking, when Xian turned around and went upstairs to her room to tidy up the things she had brought. End of this chapter. Chapter 3. False Retention. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 3 False Retention. Not long after, when Xian came down from upstairs carrying a black backpack, without any extra items. Geng Shikui heard the sound upstairs and looked up at when Xian. This was the first time in the 3 months since when Xian arrived at the Geng family that he had seriously scrutinized the little girl. When Xian and Su Li do not have much similarity in appearance. Her skin is fair, her eyes are black and bright, and she looks a bit wild. Her actions carry a certain aura. It is undeniable that when Xian is very beautiful, giving people a stunning feeling. When Xian, although you are not from the Geng family, you can continue to stay. There is no need to leave in such a hurry. Your grandmother is in the hospital and cannot take care of you. Geng Shikui has been wandering in the mall for many years, and his personality has long been honed to be very smooth. Although he doesn't like the daughter brought back by his wife at all, after all, she still owes her some love after cutting her liver to save Geng Qiu. No need, I won't tell Grandma about today's situation. Grandma's health is not good, so there's no need for you to disturb her with this matter. When Xian initially moved into the Geng family to make her grandmother feel at ease. She is looking forward to leaving here at this time. Take this card and I will make your mother pay you living expenses every month. If your sister has it, you will have it. Geng Shikui stood up from the sofa, not caring about when Xian's estranged attitude at all. Instead, he had a fatherly attitude and wanted to work hard to regain his image, fearing that when Xian would leave the Geng family and cause trouble with his liver transplant. I don't need it, money, I have some. She has money like that. When Xian fell silent and walked towards the front door without looking back. Mrs. Geng, who had been sitting on the sofa without saying a word, looked at the cold and thin figure and snorted coldly, humph. Even after raising it for 3 months, it's still an unfamiliar white-eyed wolf. She won't say a word before leaving. Grandma, maybe it's because my older sister couldn't marry into the Zhao family, which is too disappointing. After all, she came from the countryside and wanted to fly up to the branches and become a phoenix. Now that her dream has shattered, of course she's not happy. After driving away when Xian, Geng Qiu's overall mood improved. She just wanted to see when Xian in a state of decline. She hated her aloof and arrogant attitude. She thought it would be best if when Xian could freeze to death on the streets of Ice City. She hates her so much these 3 months. Thinking of the bulging black backpack when Xian left, she immediately instigated her to speak. Grandma, hurry up and take a look in the room. She's from the countryside, she's not rich. She probably stole your treasure, right? On the surface, she doesn't want our family's money, but behind the scenes. All right. Stop talking, when Xian saved your life at least. She shouldn't be so bad. Geng Shikui hypocritically spoke, his gaze indifferent as he glanced at Su Li sitting beside him without saying a word, and reached out to grab Su Li's hand on his lap. I know her palms and backs are all flesh, and when Xian has a bad temper with you. I don't want her to make you angry every day. Don't worry, I will arrange someone to take care of her privately. Su Li is the woman that Geng Shikui's ex-wife fell in love with at first sight after her death. He still dotes on Su Li very much, and to some extent, he will still consider Su Li's feelings. Upon hearing Geng Shikui's soft words of comfort, Su Li lifted her head and smiled gently at him. In fact, She was not worried about how Wen Xian would live after leaving the Geng family, but felt that something was wrong. Wen Xian's happy departure was somewhat unexpected to her. End of this chapter. Chapter 4. Donating liver is a debt I owe. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 4. Donating liver is a debt I owe. Wen Xian has been a bad-tempered person since she was young. Whenever she encounters something that doesn't satisfy her, she will directly use force to solve it. However, this time when she comes from Gufang town, she is not quite right. This kind of submissive attitude is completely different from her previous habits. When Xian came out of the villa of the Geng family and looked at the snowflakes scattered by the cold wind, he took a deep breath, feeling relieved, and finally got rid of that hypocritical place. Take out a thick black phone from your pocket and lightly touch it with your slender and clean fingers. Click on the unread message on the communication software, raise your eyebrows slightly, and the shallow curve of your mouth is arrogantly displayed. Gently pulling up her scarf, when Xian buried her beautiful chin in it, glanced at a black SUV parked not far away, and walked over. Not far from the same villa area, there was a black Maybach parked. The car window in the back seat of Maybach slowly lowered, and a deep gaze fell on the slender and tall figure. In the back seat of the car, a man with legs crossed, dressed in a black shirt, arms casually draped over the car window, and a cigarette sandwiched between his well-defined fingers. The crimson flames were even more dazzling in the wind. Are you sure the person I'm looking for is that little girl? She bought that ancient jade. The man's skin is porcelain white, his nose is high and straight, his deep eyebrows and eyes are half closed, and his thin lips are raised, with a hint of sarcasm. Faced with the man's questioning, the driver awkwardly pushed the sunglasses on his face and looked at the thin figure of the girl, speaking somewhat inexplicably. That should be right, our message shows that the girl took away the ancient jade, and the displayed location is here. Listening to the driver's uncertain tone, the man's face darkened slightly. You can go to the intelligence department to further your studies. The man lightly flicked the cigarette ash and looked coldly at the girl walking to the intersection, his eyes slightly frozen. The girl neatly pulled off the scarf from her neck, her long black hair blown away by the wind, accompanied by scattered snowflakes in the sky, making her look a bit more fairy-like and incredibly beautiful. Especially when she lifted her foot into the car, the red rope on her ankle was exposed, making her ankle slender and fair like jade, making it impossible to move her eyes. Seventh Lord. The driver didn't notice the change in the man behind him, and he was interrupted when he wanted to say something more. Alright, you go investigate the information about that girl and also include the owner of this villa. Watching the girl leave in the car, the man withdrew his gaze and took a puff of smoke. His knuckled fingers extinguished the smoke and closed the car window. Sitting in the car, Wen Xian saw a seductive and extreme face. Glancing lightly at the woman beside her, she realized that she didn't have that kind of fairy makeup painted today. She curled her lips and chuckled lightly, casually throwing her black backpack aside, and spoke in a slightly hoarse voice. You're here at the right time. How's the matter that you're investigating? Guyu, have you received it? Of course Guyu has obtained it, but what is your situation? I have only been to Independence Island for 3 months, and you came here to have your liver cut. Are you crazy? The delicate woman, somewhat irritable, pulled Wen Xian's backpack aside and swiftly grabbed her clothes, wanting to examine her wounds. When the woman's hand touched the down jacket, Wen Xian tightly grabbed it and placed her hand aside, casually saying, let's just consider it debt repayment. Debt repayment. Wen Xian doesn't even owe Su Li anything. Why use your organs to repay the debt? End of this chapter. Chapter 5. Magical Ancient Jade. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 5. Magical Ancient Jade. Chu Yunxian looked at Wen Xian's slightly pale little face, her eyebrows slightly furrowed. She didn't like her sadness at all, and she felt that Wen Xian should be arrogant and arrogant. Back then, Tan Xingyue was trying to save me, that's why she became what she is now. Also, my grandmother has shown me nurturing kindness, and I can't refuse it. When Xian looked coldly at the snowflakes falling outside the window, with a slight blush at the corners of her cold eyes. It was the past she didn't want to recall. How could it be your fault? Back then, you were just a child, and you didn't apologize to the Su family. On the contrary, without you, my grandmother and Tan Xingyue wouldn't have lived to this day. Chu Yunxian was a bit emotional. She knew about Wen Xian's past, but it wasn't her fault. He had to take all the responsibility on himself, and she was just an 18-year-old girl. Alright, let's not talk about this anymore. It's all cut. What's the use of this? Show me the ancient jade you brought back. I heard that ancient jade has a miraculous effect on body tissue recovery. Perhaps Xingyue can recover soon. Looking at Wen Xian's hopeful expression, Chu Yunxian closed her eyes and let out a soft sigh. She took out a red cloth-wrapped box from her pocket and placed it in her hand. Opening the layers of wrapped red cloth, Wen Xian took out the ancient jade and placed it in her hand. The special feeling surprised her slightly, and the corner of her mouth couldn't help but rise slightly. Perhaps I really found the treasure this time, thank you. Chu Yunxian, standing beside her, looked at Wen Xian's bright black eyes and let out a faint hum. She leaned back in her chair and said, I let my words push all the recent orders. Your body needs to rest well, so it's not suitable to take on any more orders. Carefully packing the ancient jade away and placing it in his backpack, Wen Xian regained his dominant sitting posture and lazily leaned back in the chair. I'm going to the capital, and I promised Mrs. Zhao to help her good friend treat her illness. She's already 80 years old, and she still has a crush relationship. This is really enviable. I'll go with you. You're such a person, I'm really not very confident. Upon hearing that Wen Xian was going to the capital alone, Chu Yunxian sat up nervously. She couldn't rest assured that she would go to the capital alone, as those people in the capital had spent a lot of money waiting for her to fall into the trap. No need, I'm not alone either. Mr. Zhao said she would have someone take me there. After all, the Mu family in Beijing is not a place I can go alone if I want to. The next morning, when Xian walked into the hospital and heard the familiar and harsh voice. Her once cold face turned cold, and the nurses passing by couldn't help but distance themselves from her. Mom, how can you blame me? I can't even treat her as my own daughter. If it weren't for her, how could my daughter have become a disabled person in a wheelchair? You know how excellent Xingyue is, but it's because of her. Enough. If I knew you were like this, I wouldn't even agree to let her save your daughter. Xingyue's situation is not her fault at all, it's you. If you hadn't married Xingyue to Bingqing before she turned 1, she would have suffered so much. As the words fell, there was a fierce cough accompanied by Su Li's nervous soothing voice. When Xian's thin body lazily leaned against the wall, her slender fingers twirling around her phone, her gaze fixed on the direction outside the window, unsure of what she was thinking. After a long time, the ward quieted down. A woman dressed in gorgeous clothes walked out of the ward. She noticed the figure standing by the door, snorted coldly, and left straight towards the elevator. End of this chapter. Chapter 6. Touching Undeserved Emotions. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 6. Touching Undeserved Emotions. Taking back her thoughts, when Xian put her phone in her pocket, tidied up her clothes, rubbed her cheeks, pushed open the door to the ward, and walked into it. The elderly person lying in bed heard the hospital room door open and turned to look at Wen Xian, who walked in. She sat up excitedly. Xin, when did you come? You. Your mother. She. Watching the old man's nervous expression, Wen Xian walked quickly to his side, grabbed his dry hand, and smiled lightly. Grandma, don't get excited. You don't have to worry about me either. Take good care of yourself. When your body recovers, I will take you back to Gufang town. The flowers and melons at home are still waiting for you. Okay, when we get better, let's go back to Gufang town. The elderly woman breathed a sigh of relief as she watched as Wen Xian's emotions were not affected. Wen Xian stayed with the elderly in the ward for a while, and only came out of the ward when her grandmother fell asleep. She had already regained her appearance of not being close to strangers. At this moment, the phone in Wen Xian's pocket rang. Wen Xian took out the phone and saw that it was from Mrs. Zhao. She answered the phone while walking outside. Miss Xian, when will you come over? It snowed heavily yesterday and the road is slippery today. Should I come over and pick you up? Mrs. Zhao's voice on the other end of the phone was kind and gentle. Wen Xian's originally restless mood gradually calmed down, and her voice remained cold. No need, I'll be there in half an hour. Okay, then Grandma will wait for you to come over. Coincidentally, Yuzhen is also at home today. You two should get to know each other. Upon hearing the name Zhao Yuzhen, Wen Xian's temple jumped, causing her head to ache. She had originally thought that the matter would be resolved yesterday, but she didn't expect that Mrs. Zhao still had the idea of matching them. At the hotel, Mu Qingxi casually flipped through the documents sent by Mu Bei. He looked at the girl in the photo and couldn't help but marvel at how beautiful she was. Just as he saw the last line of information, his pupils involuntarily dilated and he said, 50 days ago, I donated my liver. Thinking of the slim figure of the girl and seeing the word liver donation, his fingers couldn't help but grip tightly. The Geng family is really amazing. They even asked her to donate her liver like that. Mu Bei, who was processing the documents, felt a sudden low pressure and looked up towards his master in a panic. He held his breath and pondered whether he had done something wrong again. Seventh Lord. When will Lianglu come over? Didn't you mention the plane this morning? What time did you make an appointment with the old lady of the Zhao family? Mu Qingxi withdrew his thoughts and threw the materials in his hand onto the table, but the inexplicable restlessness did not disappear. Liang Xiao had already arrived at Bingqing at 7 o'clock. He is currently handing over to the 19th Institute and will come back in about an hour. Mrs. Zhao has scheduled an appointment with you for 11 noon today. 7th Master, please prepare. Mu Qingxi's visit to Ice City this time was not only to find Guyu for Madame Mu, but also to take over the power of the Mu family in Ice City. He had always refused, but after coming over yesterday, he suddenly changed his mind and felt that staying in Ice City for a period of time was also good. You go prepare some gifts, after all, Mrs. Zhao is for her grandmother. Perhaps this doctor can treat her symptoms this time. After speaking, Mu Qingxi stood up, picked up the cigarette placed on the table, and walked towards the balcony. For some reason, he was very restless at this moment. After leaving the hospital, Wen Xian arrived at the Zhao family alone with a black backpack. End of this chapter. Chapter 7. Don't want to trouble your door. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 7. Don't want to trouble your door. When Xian's slender fingers rested on Mrs. Zhao's wrist, her eyebrows and eyes lowered without any emotion, and her beautiful and slender eyelashes gently blinked. Mrs. Zhao looked at Wen Xian's stunning profile with a gentle smile on her kind face and said, Miss Xian, shouldn't you go to school at your age? I heard that you haven't gone to school for the past few months while recuperating in Bingqing. If you want to go to school, I can arrange for your family to help you. Wen Xian, who was feeling the pulse of the old lady, heard that she was going to school. She looked up at Mrs. Zhao and said, this matter won't bother the old lady anymore. If I wanted to go to school, I would have gone to school long ago. I have other things to deal with. Taking back the hand placed on Mrs. Zhao's wrist, Wen Xian smiled softly, her originally cold cheeks rarely showing a delicate smile. Looking at Wen Xian's smile, Mrs. Zhao was slightly stunned. When she saw Wen Xian for the first time, she felt that this little girl was lovable, but she didn't expect her smile to be so dazzling. After Wen Xian went to the Zhao family to diagnose Mrs. Zhao's pulse, he took out a paper and pen from his backpack and neatly wrote a prescription, handing it to the butler beside him. "Madam, as I said, no matter what, you can't be angry. Nothing is as important as your health." Wen Xian's voice was cold, but it was very pleasant to hear in Mrs. Zhao's ear. Mrs. Zhao looked at Wen Xian with a loving smile. "I certainly remember what Miss Xian said. Don't worry, there's nothing that can make me angry. I have to wait and see you marry into our Zhao family. Yuzheng's child came back yesterday, and I really want him to meet you. Madam, I'm not suitable for Mr. Zhao." Wen Xian raised her hand and rubbed her slightly painful temple, refusing in a cold voice. She didn't have much interest in emotional matters. "How do you know it's not suitable if you don't see it? My grandson is raised by me alone, and he's like a dragon and phoenix among people. You won't be at a disadvantage if you marry him, Miss Xian." Mrs. Zhao seemed like a grandmother selling melons, trying to praise her grandson, afraid that Wen Xian would despise her family's grandson. Looking at Mrs. Zhao's hard-selling behavior, Wen Xian was amused by her and said, "Madam, I'm afraid Mr. Zhao already has a crush on him. I'm not interested in him either." Wen Xian has never liked to beat around the bush when speaking. She didn't want the old lady to be embarrassed if she didn't take out the photos, but she didn't want to trouble such things to fall on her head. After all, she didn't have the patience to handle these things. How could it be? Did you hear what the Geng family said? I'll tell you, the Geng family did talk about Geng Qiu and Yuzheng yesterday, but I was interested in you, that's why I agreed to marry the Geng family. If it weren't for you, how could I agree to marry the Geng family? Mrs. Zhao is a genius. She grew up in the capital and has seen all kinds of people. She despises the Geng family from the bottom of her heart. How could she agree to let her precious grandson be with that little girl from the Geng family? Watching the old lady's resolute expression, Wen Xian knew that if she didn't provide some evidence, the trouble wouldn't be solved. She took out her phone from her pocket, lightly tapped it a few times, and then handed it over to Mrs. Zhao. "Madam, Zhao Gongzi has already had a crush on me. Please don't drag me into this trouble. As you know, I just want to take my grandmother for treatment and have no other thoughts." End of this chapter. Chapter 8. Unfortunately, not being an actor. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 8. Unfortunately, not being an actor put his acupuncture and moxibustion, paper and pen in his backpack, and Wen Xian took back his mobile phone from the old lady who was in a daze. "Old lady, let your friend's younger generation contact me when he comes, and I will go back first." After seeing the photos that Wen Xian showed her, Mrs. Zhao realized that there was really no possibility of her grandson and Wen Xian anymore. She stood up from the chair and said, "It's true that my grandson is not worthy of you. I'll take you down. I originally wanted to leave Wen Xian for lunch before letting her and Yuzheng go to the Mu family in the capital. Now it seems unnecessary, and she can only retract that idea." Wen Xian did not refuse Zhao Laofu's idea of sending her downstairs. She carried her backpack on her body, reached out her hand to support the old lady's arm, and helped her down the stairs. "She grew up with my mother and has been a crazy girl since childhood. She only knows how to fight, has a bad temper, and causes trouble all day. Her personality is completely different from Qiuqiu's. Qiuqiu at home has been proficient in music, chess, calligraphy, and painting since childhood, and will participate in piano competitions in a week." Su Li praised her daughter with great effort. Today, she brought Geng Qiu to the Zhao family to correct his name, so that she wouldn't let Wen Xian steal Geng Qiu's happiness. Qiuqiu is indeed excellent. Apart from the Miss Wei from the Wei family, she is also outstanding in the socialite circle. We are also happy that Yuzheng can be with Qiuqiu. Mrs. Zhao spoke in agreement, not forgetting to lightly pat the little hand of the girl next to her. "As you praised me downstairs," Mrs. Zhao couldn't help but grab Wen Xian's wrist. When Xian looked at her caught wrist and chuckled lightly, the old lady just said she wouldn't get angry, but now she can't control her temper anymore. When Xian's reminder brought Zhao Laofu back to her senses. She gently patted Wen Xian's small hand, which she supported, and said, "You shouldn't have saved them. Look at you, it's been 2 months and you haven't recovered yet." Mrs. Zhao looked at Wen Xian with both heartache and anger. If she had known that Wen Xian had cut his liver for Geng Qiu, she would have definitely intervened to stop her. Wen Xian. A voice that was close to screaming came from downstairs. Geng Qiu stood up to go to the bathroom and accidentally saw Wen Xian coming down from upstairs. Watching Wen Xian and the old lady so intimate made her unable to accept it for a moment. She couldn't help but scream. After Wen Xian helped the old lady downstairs, he ignored Geng Qiu standing at the staircase and left directly. Unwilling to be ignored, Geng Qiu excitedly stepped forward and grabbed Wen Xian's arm. Her originally rosy face turned pale because she couldn't accept Wen Xian's appearance. She bit her lower lip in injustice, hesitated for a while, and spoke with a crying voice. "Wen Xian, are you not willing to let my father reveal that the Geng family has nothing to do with you, so you came to Grandma Zhao to say bad things? Are you trying to ruin the relationship between me and Yuzheng brother? I tell you, Yuzheng and I have been childhood sweethearts, and even if you say bad things about me." Halfway through, Geng Qiu sobbed weakly, one hand covering his chest, tears streaming down his cheeks. His pale face, with weak sobs, looked like a flower that could fall at any moment, making people feel both heartbroken and pitiful. Upon seeing such a scene, Zhao Yuzheng immediately stood up and walked to Geng Qiu's side. He held Geng Qiu in his arms with heartache and looked at Wen Xian with a cold expression in his eyes. "No matter what you say to my grandmother, I'll tell you, the only person I like is Geng Qiu. Don't have any ulterior motives." Looking at the two people in front of her with a deep and affectionate expression, Wen Xian couldn't help but chuckle out loud. She raised her hand and pulled away Geng Qiu's arm, saying, "It's a pity if you don't learn how to perform. You can't even act like a golden horse queen." End of this chapter. Chapter 9. Divine Doctor. Where is the Divine Doctor? You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 9 Divine Doctor. Where is the Divine Doctor? How could you say that to me? If you weren't here to speak ill of me, why did you come to the Zhao family? You're from the countryside, and you'll never know the Zhao family's address in your lifetime. Thinking that Wen Xian deliberately came to slander her, Geng Qiu couldn't care about maintaining her image as a lady anymore. She broke free from Zhao Yuzheng and rushed towards Wen Xian. Watching Geng Qiu pounce with a cold eye, Wen Xian calmly flashed over and only saw Geng Qiu fall to the ground in embarrassment. After Geng Qiu fell, Su Li quickly ran over and glared angrily at Wen Xian with sharp eyes. She had the heart to kill Wen Xian. "Wen Xian, you're done. Qiu has just recovered from her serious illness. How could you bully Qiu like this? You're too much." Zhao Yuzheng shouted at Wen Xian as he watched Geng Qiu fall in embarrassment. "All right. Look at what you all look like. Wen Xian is a distinguished guest I invited over, pay attention to your attitude." Zhao Laofu spoke coldly, and she now understood why Wen Xian didn't like her own grandson. The farce stopped with the old lady's scolding, and Zhao Yuzheng and Su Li helped Geng Qiu, who was crying on the ground with pear blossoms and rain, up, their eyes filled with heartache. "Wen Xian, have you seen it? Mom loves me, and Yuzheng's brother only likes me. You will always be the one who nobody loves or likes. Your life is destined to be lonely and you don't deserve to be loved, and no one will like you, this celestial ghost and lonely star." Geng Qiu hates Wen Xian, and her current embarrassment is caused by Wen Xian. Faced with such unpleasant words, Wen Xian suddenly chuckled and said, "What you want is something I don't care about." Wen Xian walked towards the direction outside the door without looking back. Opening the door, when Xin saw the butler standing outside, with two men wearing black windbreakers standing beside him. When Xin only nodded slightly at the butler and walked away. Standing beside the butler, Mu Qingxi watched the girl's pale face, his deep eyes slightly narrowed. They had been standing outside the door for some time, and he could hear clearly what had happened in the living room. Sorry for keeping Mu Xiao waiting here for so long. Mu Xiao and Liang Xiao, please come with me. The butler looked awkwardly at the two people standing outside the door. Excuse me, butler. Watching the slender and thin figure disappear outside the Zhao family gate, Mu Qingxi withdrew his gaze and spoke softly. Liang Luoyu, standing beside him, saw all of Mu Qingxi's movements in his eyes. He turned his head to look in the direction of the gate, and a playful smile curved around his lips. He felt that his seventh master seemed to have something wrong with him. Mu Qingxi followed the butler into the living room of the Zhao family and happened to see Zhao Yuzhen picking up Geng Qiu, who was sitting on the ground. His eyebrows furrowed slightly, and his eyes were full of disgust. Why did Xiao Yu and Qi Xiao come so early? The butler asked the kitchen to prepare lunch. Mrs. Zhao had now regained her former dignity, as if what had just happened was not happening in front of her. She spoke warmly to the two people who had walked in from outside. Auntie, aren't you happy that we came over to see you earlier? I just came over to see you after finishing my work. Seemingly sensing that the atmosphere was not quite right, Liang Luoyu walked up with the gift in his hand and placed it on the coffee table, his dog legs opening up. Xiao Yu is the most thoughtful. How is your grandfather? Mrs. Zhao looked at the coquettish appearance of Liang Lu and enthusiastically took her hand, starting to talk casually, completely avoiding Mrs. Zhao and Su Li standing on the side. Madam, I'm here today to see the doctor you mentioned. I'm not sure if it's convenient for me to meet you. End of this chapter. Chapter 10. Buy more sugar for the divine doctor to eat. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 10. Buy more sugar for the divine doctor to eat. Compared to the dog legs of Lianglu, Mu Qingxi didn't have much patience to talk to Mrs. Zhao here. His mind was now filled with Wen Xian's pale little face, and he had an impulse to chase him out and take a look. You said that miracle doctor, she. As soon as the old lady spoke, she caught the attention of everyone in the living room, especially Su Li, who looked at Mrs. Zhao expectantly. Geng Qiu was not in good health, and although she had changed her liver, she still wanted to see a doctor who treated the old lady. Noticing Su Li's actions on the side, the old lady suddenly stopped and gave the butler a faint glance. The butler understood and walked upstairs. Seemingly noticing that the atmosphere was not quite right, Su Li coughed awkwardly and said, Madam, I came here today partly to discuss the marriage between Qiu and Yuzhen, and also to hear that your physical recovery was taken care of by a divine doctor, so I would like to trouble you to introduce me. That miraculous doctor has a strange personality, and who she treats depends entirely on her mood. The old lady spoke in a distant voice, and her impression of Su Li could be said to be extremely poor. The butler took a note from upstairs and handed it to Mu Qingxi, who was lazily sitting on the sofa. Mu Xiao, this is the contact information of that miraculous doctor. The old lady has already explained it, you can call her. Yes, I originally wanted her to wait for you at home, but it's a bit inconvenient, just contact her yourself. Thinking of the scene when Xian left just now, the old lady's sharp gaze swept around her, and her distinguished guests were driven away by these people. Folding the note handed over by the butler and putting it in the pocket of his coat, Mu Qingxi stood up from the sofa and said, Since that's the case, I won't disturb you, madam. I have something else to attend to and visit you another day. Knowing that Mu Qingxi had personally come to visit and had given her face, Mrs. Zhao gently patted Liang Luoyu's shoulder and said, Then as an elderly person, I won't give you two gifts. Please be careful on the way, and the divine doctor likes sweets. Buy more sugar, and she will be happy to eat it. When Xian, who had left the Zhao family, took a taxi to a commercial square in the city and saw a woman wearing a Barbie pink down jacket from afar. She hesitated for a moment and didn't want to go at all. The clothes were too ugly, right? She doesn't want to admit that she knows her. While when Xian was hesitating, Chu Yunxian had already noticed her. She walked quickly to Wen Xian in front of her wearing a 10-centimeter hateful sky-high and directly took Wen Xian's arm. The little girl couldn't find you early in the morning. You slept with me last night, why aren't you responsible for me? Chu Yunxian looked at Wen Xian with a aggrieved expression, and even after speaking, she didn't forget to use her moist big eyes to blink at Wen Xian. Haha. At this moment, a light laugh came from behind the family, and Chu Yunxian suddenly turned back. Her once pitiful eyes became very fierce, as if blaming the man behind her for not having any gentlemanly demeanor. Sorry, I couldn't hold back. Liang Luoyu looked at Chu Yunchuan's seductive face and hesitated for a few seconds before gently waving his hand. I'm not mocking you. Don't explain, it's useless. A man who looks quite human is actually eavesdropping on a girl's speech. He's not a gentleman at all. Despite taking the initiative to approach Liang Luoyu, Chu Yunxian stopped teasing Wen Xian and took her by the arm as she walked towards the mall. Wen Xian, let me tell you, when you go to the capital, you must buy some branded bags and clothes. Those people in the capital are all snobbish and cannot be looked down upon by them. End of this chapter.